Hey, you know what time it is. Woo! Get into it! Get into it! Yes! Hallelujah! Woo! Honey, I'm so glad you've come to stay. Hi, lovelies. We are back with Storytime with Chris. Let me explain a couple of things. So, I did read chapter 17. However, in the midst of me reading chapter 17, I didn't realize that I was streaming on Instagram. So if you're looking for that chapter, it's on my Instagram. I apologize. I was rushing setting up and I didn't realize that I had streamed on Instagram. So you're getting a double taste today, because typically this would be on Wednesday and Instagram is Tuesday, Thursday, Facebook is Monday, Wednesday, and then Sunday is our Sunday reading, which I have not forgotten about that. So on Sunday we'll be reading Stuart Little, so that is available. I definitely am taking the time tomorrow night to try to upload the more recent episodes of Storytime with Chris onto the YouTube channel. So if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and like, share, and subscribe. The link to my YouTube channel is within my bio, as well as my bio on Instagram. So, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and begin, okay? Get yourself comfortable. Alright. Yep, that's where we're at. Okay, I got you. Chapter 18. The Free Camotes. From small Avren they wended eastward at an easy pace, halting as it pleased them, sleeping on the turf or sheltering in one of the many farmsteads among the rich green vales. This was the land of the Free Camotes, of cottages clustering in loose circles rimmed by cultivated fields and pastures. Taran found the Camote folk courteous and hospitable. Though he named himself only as Taran Wanderer, the dwellers in these hamlets and villages respected his privacy and asked nothing of his birthplace, rank, or destination. Taran and Gurgi had ridden into the outskirts of Sanarth, when Taran reined up Melalas at a long, low-roofed shed from which rang the sound of hammer on anvil. Within he found the smith, a barrel-chested, leather-aproned man with a stubbly black beard and a great shock of black hair bristling as a brush. His eyelashes were scorched, grime and soot smudged his face, sparks rained on his bare shoulders, but he seemed to count them no more than fireflies. In a voice like stones rattling on a bronze shield, he roared out a song in time with his hammer, stroked so loudly that Taran judged the man's lungs as leathery as his bellows. While Gurgi cautiously drew back from the shower of sparks, Taran called a greeting, scarcely able to make himself heard above the din. "Master Smith," he said, bowing deeply as the man at last caught sight of him and put down the hammer. "I am called Taran Wanderer, and I journey seeking a craft to help me earn my bread. I know a little of your art, and ask you to teach me more. I have no gold or silver to pay you, but name any task and I will do it gladly."
"Away with you," shouted the smith. "Tasks I have plenty, but no time for teaching others to do them."
"Is time what lacks?" Taran said, glancing shrewdly at the smith. "I've heard it said that a man must be a true master of his craft if he would teach it."
"Hold!"
roared the smith as Taran was about to turn away. He snatched up the hammer, and as he meant to throw it at Taran's head,
"You doubt my skill? I've flattened men on my anvil for less. Skill? In all the Free Camotes, none is greater than Hevid, son of Hiras."
Hevid, son of Hirwas. Hirwas. That's an interesting inflection. Hirwas. It's Hirwas. Hirwas. There we go. With that, he seized the tongs, threw a pair of red-hot iron from the roaring furnace, flung it on the anvil, and set to hammering with such quick strokes that Taran could hardly follow the movement of Hevid's muscular arm, and suddenly there formed at the end of the bar a hawthorn blossom, perfect in every turn of leaf and petal. Taran looked at it in astonishment and in admiration. "Never have I seen work so deftly done."
"Nor will you see it anywhere else,"
Hevid answered, at pains to hide a proud grin.
"But what tale do you tell me? You know the shaping of metal. The secrets are not given to many. Even I have not gained them all."
Angrily he shook his bristly head.
"The deepest, ha! They lie hidden in Anuven, stolen by Arorn, Death Lord. Lost they are, lost forever to Predain. But here, take these, ordered the smith, pressing the tongs and hammer into Taran's hands. Beat the bar smooth as it was, and quickly before it cools. Show me what strength you have in those chicken wings of yours.
My arms are, well, I have slight muscles, but chicken wings. Taran strode to the anvil, and as Cole had taught him long ago, did his best to straighten the rapidly cooling iron. The smith folded his huge arms, eyed him critically for a time, then burst into loud laughter. Hi, Derek.
Enough! Enough! Cried Heaven. You speak truth. Of the art, indeed, you know little. And yet, he added, rubbing his chin with a battered thumb nearly as thick as his fist, and yet you have the sense of it. He looked closely at Taran. But have you courage to stand up to fire? To fight hot iron with only hammer and tongs?
Teach me the craft, Taran replied. You'll have no need to teach me courage.
Boldly said, cried Heaven, clapping Taran on the shoulder. I'll temper you well in my forge. Prove yourself to me, and I'll vow to make a smith of you. Now, to begin. His eye fell on Taran's empty scabbard. Once it would seem you bore a blade?
Once I did, Taran answered, but it is long gone, and now I journey weaponless.
Then you shall make a sword, commanded Heaven, and when you've done, you'll tell me which is harder labor, smiting or smithing.
To this Taran learned the answer soon enough. The next several days were the most toilsome he had ever spent. He thought at first the smith would set him to work shaping one of the many bars already in the forge, but Heaven had no such intention.
What start when half the work is done? Heaven snorted. No, my lad, you'll forge a sword from beginning to end.
Thus, the first task Heaven gave Taran was gathering fuel for the furnace, and from dawn to dusk Taran stoked the fire until he saw the forge as a roaring, flame-tongued monster that could never eat its fill. Even though the work had only begun, Heaven soon put up to shoveling in a very mountain of stones, then smelting out the metal they bore. By the time the bar itself was cast, Taran's face and arms were scorched and blackened, and his hands were covered with more blisters than skin. His back ached, his eyes and ears rang with all the clank and clatter, and with Heaven's voice shouting orders and instructions. Gurgi, who had offered to pump the bellows, never faltered even when a cloud of sparks burst and flew into his shaggy hair, singeing it away in patches until he looked as if a flock of birds had plucked him to make their nests. Hold on 1 second. Hold on. Take. Some yerba mate. It is delicious, children. Also, fun fact, for those who are watching, I don't drink coffee or energy drinks. This is literally me, every time. I've tried coffee when I was 8. I was trying to be like my granddad and my grandma because they drink coffee. It didn't work. Not a coffee person, not an espresso person. I enjoy tea. Tea is magical.
Life's a forge, cried the smith as Taran, his brow streaming, beat at the strip of metal. Yes, and hammer and anvil too. You'll be roasted, smelted, and pounded. You'll scarce know what's happening to you. But stand boldly to it. Metal's worthless till it's shaped and tempered.
Despite the weariness that made him drop gratefully a day's end to the straw pallet in the shed, Taran's heart quickened and his spirits rose as the blade little by little took shape on the anvil. The heavy hammer seemed to weigh more each time he lifted it, but at last, with a joyous cry, he flung it down and raised the finished sword, well wrought and balanced, gleaming brightly in the light of the forge.
"A handsome weapon, Master Smith," he cried, "as fair as the one I bore." "What then?" Heaven exclaimed. "Have you done your work so well? Would you trust your life to a blade untried?" He flung out a burly arm toward a wooden block in a corner of the forge. "Strike hard," he commanded, "the flat, the edge, and the point."
Proudly, Taran raised the sword high and swung it down to the block. The weapon shuddered with the force of the blow. A sharp crack and clang smote his ears as the blade shattered and the shards went flying in all directions. Taran shouted in dismay and could have wept as he stared, disbelieving, and could have picked up at the broken hilt still clutched in his hand. He turned and gave Heaven a despairing glance. "So-ho!" cried the smith, not at all distressed by Taran's wretched and rueful expression. "Did you think to gain a worthy blade at first go?" He laughed loudly and shook his head. "And what must I do?" Taran cried, appalled at Heaven's words. "Do?" the smith retorted. "What else but start anew?" And so they did, but this time for Taran there remained little of his joyous hopes. He labored grimly and doggedly, all the more dejected when Heaven ordered him to cast aside 2 new blades even before they were tempered, judging them already flawed. The reek of hot metal clung in his nostrils and flavored even the food he hastily swallowed. The billows of steam from the great quenching tub choked him as if he were breathing clouds of scalding fog. The ceaseless din almost addled his wits, until indeed he felt it was himself, not the blade, being hammered. The next blade he shaped seemed to him ugly, dented and scarred, without the fair proportions of the first, and this too he would have cast aside had not the smith ordered him to finish it. "This may well serve," Heaven told him confidently, despite the doubtful look Taran gave him. Again Taran strode to the block and raised the sword, doing his best to shatter the ungraceful weapon. He brought it down with all his strength. The blade rang like a bell. This time, it was the block that split into 2. "Now," said Heaven quietly, "that's a blade worth bearing." Then he clapped his hands and seized Taran's arm. "You've strengthened those chicken wings after all. You've proved yourself as well as proved the blade. Stay, lad, and I'll teach you all I know." Taran said nothing for a time, but looked not without pride at the new forged blade. "You have already taught me much," he said at last to Heaven, "though I lost what I had hoped to gain, for I had hoped I was indeed a swordsmith. I have learned that I am not." "How then?" cried Heaven. "You're the makings of an honest swordsmith, as good as any in Prydain." "It cheers me to think that may be true," Taran answered, "but I know in my heart your craft is not mine. A spur drove me from small Avrin, and it drives me now, and so must I journey even if I wish to stay." The smith nodded. "You are a well-mannered wanderer, so be it. I ask no man to go against his heart. Keep the blade in token of friendship. Yours it is, more so than any other, for you forged it with your own hands." "It is not a noble weapon, and thus it suits me all the more." Taran laughed, glancing at the ungainly sword. "Lucky it was that I didn't have to make a dozen before it." "Luck?" snorted Heaven, as Taran and Gurgi took leave of him. "Not so! More labor than luck. Life's a forge. Say I, face the pounding, don't fear the proving, and you'll stand well against any hammer and anvil." With Heaven the smith waving his sooty hand in farewell, the companions traveled on, bearing northward along the rich valley of Great Avrin. A few days of easy riding through pleasant countryside brought them to the edge of Comet Gwyneth. Here a shower suddenly began pelting down on them, and the wayfarers galloped for the first shelter they could find. It was a cluster of sheds, stables, chicken roosts, and storehouses, seeming to ramble in all directions. But as Taran dismounted and hastened to the cottage, and amid the maze of buildings, he realized all were linked by covered walkways or flagstone paths, and whichever he followed would sooner or later have brought him to the doorway that opened almost before he knocked on it. "Come in, and a good greeting to you," called a voice crackling like twigs in a fire. As Gurgi scuttled inside to escape the teeming rain, Taran saw a bent old woman cloaked in gray beckoning him to the hearth. Her long hair was white as the wool on the distaff hanging from her belt of plaited cords. Below her short-girt robe, her pointy shins looked thin and hard as spindles. A web of wrinkles covered her face. Her cheeks were withered, but for all her years she gave no sign of frailty, as though time had only toughened and seasoned her, and her gray eyes were sharp and bright as a pair of new needles. "I'm Devok." Devok. Yeah, okay. So D-W-Y. Devok. Interesting. "I am Devok." "Reaver woman," she replied, as Taran bowed courteously and told her his name. "Taran, wanderer," she repeated with a tart smile. "From the look of you, I'd say you indeed been wandering." More than you've been washing, and that's clear as the warp and weft of my loom.
Yes, yes, cried Gurgi. See loom of weaving, see windings and bindings, so many it makes Gurgi's poor tender head swim with twirlings and whirlings.
Taran, for the first time, noticed a high loom standing like a giant harp of 1,000 strings in a corner of the cottage. Around it were stacked bobbins of thread of all colors. From the rafters dangled skeins of yarn, honks and hanks of wool and flax. On the walls hung lengths of finished fabric, some of bright hue and simple design, others of subtle craftsmanship and patterns more difficult to follow. Taran gazed astonished at the endless variety, then turned to the weaver woman of Gwyneth. "This calls for skill beyond anything I know," he said admiringly. "How is such work done?"
"All done?" the weaver woman chuckled. "It would take me more breath to tell you that you have ears to listen. But if you look, you'll see."
So saying, she hobbled to the loom, climbed to the bench in front of it, and with surprising vigor began plying the shuttle back and forth, all the while working her feet on the trendles below, hardly pausing to glance at her handiwork. At last she stood, cocked her head at Taran, fixed him with her sharp gray eyes, and said,
"This is it done, wanderer, as all things are, each in its own way, thread by thread."
Taran's amazement had grown all the more. "This would I gladly learn," he said eagerly. "The craft of a swordsmith was not mine. Perhaps the craft of the weaver may be. I pray you, will you teach it to me?"
"That I will, since you asked,"
replied Duvak.
"But mind you, it is one thing to admire a well-woven bit of cloth, and another to sit yourself before the loom."
"My thanks to you," Taran exclaimed. "I'll not fear to labor at your loom. With Heaven the smith, I didn't shrink from hot iron or the flames of his forge, and a weaver's shuttle is a lighter burden than a smith's hammer."
"Think you so?"
Duvak asked, with a dry chuckle that sounded like knitting needles clicking together.
"Then what shall you weave to begin with?" she went on, eyeing him sharply. "Taran wanderer, you call yourself? Taran threadbare would be more like it. Would you weave yourself a new cloak? Thus you'll gain something to put on your back, and I'll see what skill you have in your fingers."
Which, by the way, kids, fun fact, before we had, like, industrial factory machines, and hopefully teachers or parents, whoever is watching this, a spinning wheel, if you've ever seen Sleeping Beauty, is simply that. It's a wheel that is able to take the thread upon a loom, so it's, Okay, let me get an example. I don't have a spinning wheel in my house. I'm not that eccentric, but that would be cool. So, here's the needle, right? The needle is then... Oh, wow, okay. Okay. So, let's say this is the needle of the spinning wheel, right? Typically, there's a whole bunch of thread completely surrounding it. It's just there, the needle is there to hold it. And you take a bit of that thread onto the wheel, and then there are pedals, at least one or two typically. There's a pedal on the bottom of the spinning wheel. When you press your foot on it, it allows the wheel to then move and pull the thread, and you can make it into a cloak, a hat, a shirt, a tunic, a pair of pants, a dress. And then later in life, we had, what's it called? Because there's spinning wheels, and then there's a proper name for it, and I'm drawing a blank, unfortunately. But I guess we'll just use loom. But there are actual, like, tall looms to where, like, you'll have multiple stations of thread of different colors and different varieties, and you use this bar to thread them. You use a bar to thread them together, and it pulls the thread together and tightens it and makes it to what you want it to be. There are some people that use knitting needles, some people crochet. I used to knit in college, yes. I had a group of friends who would knit occasionally. Shout out to my friend Andrea, who got me into that. And I was fairly good. I wasn't great, but I was fairly good with knitting. It was cool. I can make a hat. It's gonna take me a while, but I can make a hat. I have friends that are more impressive that can make coats and blankets and stuff like that. But we have come a long way from... There are still some people, who do use a weaving rack or a weaving machine or a spinning wheel to do their work. But we have industrial machines that expedite that process. So just a fun fact I wanted to throw out there. If you ever get a chance, try to find a picture of one or find a video of somebody practicing at the loom. It's a pretty handy skill. Taran willingly agreed, but next day, instead of teaching him weaving, Duvak led the companions to one of her many chambers, which Taran saw full nearly to bursting with piles of wool.
Tease out the thorns, pick out the cockleburs, the weaver woman ordered. Comb it, guard it carefully, wanderer, or when your cloak is done, you'll feel it's made of thistles instead of wool.
The size of the tasks ahead of him made Taran despair of ever finishing, but he and Gurgi started the painstaking work, with Duvak herself lending a hand. The aged weaver woman, Taran soon learned, had not only a tart tongue but a keen eye. Nothing escaped her. She spied the smallest knot, speck, or flaw, and brought Taran's attention to it with a sharp rap with her distaff to his knuckles. But what smarted Taran more than the distaff was to distaff. There we go. Distaff is what it's called. My apologies, y'all. Again, certain pronunciations with certain older vernacular can be a bit difficult, so bear with me. But what smarted Taran more than the distaff was to learn that Duvak, despite her years, could work faster, longer, and harder than he himself. At the end of each day, Taran's eyes were bleary, his fingers raw, and his head nodded wearily. Yet the old weaver woman was bright and spry, as if the day had scarce begun. Nevertheless, the work at last was finished, but now Duvak set him in front of a huge spinning wheel.
The finest wool is useless until it is spun to thread, the weaver woman told him, so you'd best begin learning that as well.
But spinnings are women's toilings, Gurgi protested. No, spinnings are not fitting for bored and clever weaver men.
Indeed,
snorted Duvak.
Then sit you down and learn otherwise. I've heard men complain of doing woman's work and women complain of doing man's work, she added, fastening her bony thumb and a forefinger on Gurgi's ear and marching him to a stool beside Taran. But I've never heard the work complain of who did it so long as it is done. And so, under Duvak's watchful eye, Taran and Gurgi spun thread and filled bobbins during the next few days. Chastened by Duvak's words, Gurgi did his best to help, though all too often the hapless creature managed only to tangle himself in the long strands. Which is very true. Let's be very clear, children. Everybody should be contributing. It's not just a girl's job or a woman's job to do household things. It's not just a man's job to do heavy laboring. Everybody can work. Everybody can learn a skill. Everybody can learn how to cook. Everybody can learn how to do laundry. Everybody can learn how to sew clothes and embroider. Everybody can learn how to balance a checkbook. So we're not even going to entertain that. And that's what she's saying. She's like, it doesn't matter it doesn't matter who it is as long as the work gets done. And if you have the skills to get the work done, then it doesn't matter, boy or girl. Or neither. Or other. Just get it done. Next, Duvak told the companions and took them to a shed where pots of dye bubbled over a fire. Here Taran fared no better than Gurgi, for when the yarn was at last dyed, he was bespattered from head to toe with colors, and Gurgi himself looked like a rainbow suddenly sprouting hair. Not until all these other tasks were done, Duvak's satisfaction, did she take Taran to a weaving room, and there his heart sank, for the loom stood bare and stark as a leafless tree. How then?
Clucked the weaver woman as Taran gave her a rueful glance.
The loom must be threaded, did I not tell you? All things are done step by step and strand by strand.
Heaven, the smith told me life was a forge, Taran sighed as he laboriously tried to reckon the countless threads needed, and I think I'll be well-tempered before my cloak is finished.
Life a forge? Said the weaver woman. A loom, rather, where lives and days intertwine. And wise he is who can learn to see the pattern. But if you mean to have a new cloak, you do better to work more and chatter less. Or did you hope for a host of spiders to come and labor for you? Even after deciding on the pattern and threading the loom, Taran saw only a hopeless, confusing tangle of threads. The cloth was painfully slow in forming, and at the end of a long day he had little more than a hand's breadth of fabric to show off for all his toil. Excuse me. Did I ever think a weaver's shuttle a light burden? Taran sighed. It feels heavier than hammer, tongs, and anvil altogether. It's not the shuttle that burdens you, answered Duvok, but lack of skill, a heavy burden, wanderer, that only one thing can lift.
What secret is that? Taran cried. Teach it to me now, or my cloak will never be done. But Duvok only smiled.
It is patience, wanderer. As for teaching it, that I cannot do. It is both the first thing and the last thing you must learn for yourself.
Taran gloomily went back to work, sure he would be as ancient as Duvok before finishing the garment. Nevertheless, as his hands began used to the task, the shuttle darted back and forth like a fish among reeds, and the cloth grew steadily on the loom. Though Duvok was satisfied with his progress, Taran, to his own surprise, was not. The pattern, he murmured, frowning, I don't know, somehow it doesn't please me.
Now then, wanderer, replied Duvok. No man put a sword to your throat. The choice of pattern was your own.
That it was, Taran admitted, but now I see it closely. I would rather have chosen another.
Ha ha ha! said Duvok with her dry chuckle. In that case, you have but one of two things to do. Either finish a cloak you'll be ill content to wear, or unravel it and start anew, for the loom weaves only the pattern set upon it.
Taran stood a long while at his handiwork. At last he took a deep breath, sighed, and shook his head. So be it. I'll start anew. Over the next few days he ruefully unthreaded and rethreaded the loom, but after it was ready and he began weaving once again, he was delighted to find the cloth grow faster than ever he had done before, and his spirits rose with his newfound skill. When the cloak at last was done, he held it up proudly. This is far better than what I had, he cried, but I doubt I'll ever be able to wear a cloak again without thinking of every thread. Excuse me. Sorry, I had a tickle. Hold on. Sorry, y'all, my voice gets a little dry with certain voices. Gurgi shouted triumphantly, and Duvok bowed her head in approval.
Well woven, she said. Her expression had lost much of its tartness as she looked fondly at Taran, seeming to smile within herself. You have fine skills in your fingers, wanderer, she said with unaccustomed gentleness. Enough to make you one of the finest weavers in Perdane, and if my distaff in your knuckles meant more often than you like, it was because I deemed you worth reproving. Dwell in my house if you choose, work at my loom, and what I know I will teach to you.
Taran did not answer immediately, and as he hesitated, the weaver woman smiled and spoke again.
I know what is in your heart, wanderer, she said. A young man's way is restless, yes, and a young girl's too. I'm not so gone in years that I've forgotten. Your face tells me it is not your wish to stay in Commode Gwyneth.
Taran nodded. As much as I hope to be a swordsmith, so I hope to be a weaver, but you spoke truth. This is not the way I would follow.
Then must we say farewell, answered the weaver woman. But mind you, she added in her usual sharp tone, if life is a loom, the pattern you weave is not so easily unraveled.
Taran and Gurgi set off again, still journeying northward, and soon Commode Gwyneth was far behind them. Though Taran wore his new cloak on his shoulders and his new blade at his side, his pleasure in them shortly gave way to disquiet. The words of Duvok lingered in his mind, and his thoughts turned to another loom in the distant marshes of Morva. And what of Ordu, he said. Does she weave with more than threads? The robin has truly been scratching for his worms, but have I indeed chosen my own pattern, or am I no more than a thread in her loom? For that be so, then I fear it's a thread serving little purpose. At any rate, he added with a rueful laugh, it's a long and tangled one. But these gloomy thoughts flew from his mind when some days later Melilas bore him to the top of a rise, and he looked down on the fairest commode he had ever seen. A tall stand of firs and hemlocks circled broad, well-tended fields, green and abundant. White thatched roof cottages sparkled in shafts of sunlight. The air itself seemed different to him, cool and untouched with the sharp scent of evergreens. His heart quickened as he watched, and a strange excitement filled him. Gurgi had ridden up beside him.
"Kindly master, can we not stop here?"
"Yes," Taran murmured, his eyes never leaving the fields and cottages. "Yes, here shall we rest." He urged Melilas down the slope with Gurgi cantering eagerly behind him. Crossing a shallow stream, Taran reined up at the sight of a hale old man digging busily near the water's edge. Beside him stood a pair of wooden buckets on a yoke, and into these he carefully poured spadefuls of pale brown earth. His iron-gray hair and beard were cropped short despite his age. His arms seemed as brawny as those of Heaven or the smith. "A good greeting to you, Master Dweller," Taran called. "What place is this?" The man turned, wiped his deeply lined brow with a forearm, and looked at Taran with keen blue eyes. "The water your horse is standing in and churning to mud, by the way, is Fernbreak Stream. The Kamot? This is Kamot Marin." And that is where we'll end for tonight. I'll see you next time.